Self-awareness starts as a tool you use. The paradox is that at a certain point, the tool starts using you. And that's the thing about self-awareness. It's recursive and it folds back on itself. Hi everyone, I'm Lisa, and welcome back to Self-Awareness Sucks. Before we get into it, I just want to say I'm not a psychologist, a therapist, or a medical professional, and I'm not claiming to be, and I'm not here to give advice or a diagnosis. Everything I share on this podcast is based on my own experiences, thoughts, and observations. So please take what resonates, leave what doesn't, and if you are struggling with anything I mention, please do reach out to a qualified professional or at least someone you trust. And one more thing I want to flag before we get started. This episode touches on body image, including specific things you might not have previously thought about in relation to your own body. And I'll give you a bit of a heads up in the moment before I say them, but if that is something you're particularly sensitive to right now, please take care of yourself first. You can always come back to this one when you're ready. So this is episode 17, and we're one away from the end of this season, not the end of the podcast. And I want to use it to do something I've been building towards since episode 1, which is to name the thing underneath all of it. The thing that makes self-awareness genuinely, specifically, structurally difficult, beyond just the discomfort of looking at yourself honestly. Here it is. Self-awareness is recursive. It folds back on itself. The very tool that's supposed to help you understand yourself can become the thing that traps you inside yourself. And that's not a bug. It's an inherent quality of what self-awareness is. And once you see it, you can't unsee it, which is, of course, the entire backbone of this podcast and also just another example of the exact problem I'm describing. And there are several distinct paradoxes nested inside that central idea. And this episode is going to give them names. And they all connect back to things I've talked about across this season. And together, I think they explain something I couldn't quite articulate at the start. Why becoming more self-aware can sometimes feel like it's making things harder rather than easier. And why that's not a sign you're doing it wrong. So the first one I want to call the awareness paradox. You can't change what you're not aware of. This has been the argument underlying everything in this season. Self-awareness is the prerequisite for growth. You have to see the thing before you can do anything about it. But becoming aware of something can also create a problem that didn't exist before. And I'm going to point a few things out now, and I'm going to apologise in advance because doing so might do to you exactly what was done to me and make you aware of them. So this is where body image comes up. Just a bit of a fair warning in case you want to skip ahead a bit. But specifically, what comes to mind for me when it comes to body image that I've seen a lot of discussion about on at least my algorithms on the internet are things like stretch marks and hip dips and cellulite. But also things like the sound of your own swallowing, your heartbeat, your breathing. And you're probably aware of at least one of those now in a way you weren't 30 seconds ago. And that awareness will fade, but for a moment, it's there. And that's the mechanism. And I've talked about this a lot, and I'll probably continue to do so, but body image insecurities like stretch marks and hip dips and cellulite, as well as many others, are almost preloaded by culture. The media has been naming and scrutinising those things for long enough that most people have at least some awareness of them as potential insecurities before they personally experience them as such. And I talked about this a lot in episode 7, but the one that I didn't mention, and one that surprised me and I genuinely didn't see coming, was my voice. A few years ago, I had a really bad cold that actually caused a bit of damage to my vocal cords. And so I had to go through a little bit of vocal cord therapy. And during that process, I became acutely aware of my throat in a way I never had been before, and aware of the sound I was making, and aware of the effort of speaking at volume, and aware of the fatigue that came with extended talking, which I know is ironic now, but I was so conscious of it because I had to be aware of what was going to make my throat hurt more, what could damage them further in terms of my vocal cords. And once I was aware of it, I couldn't stop being aware of it. And even just things like voice notes became daunting, and talking at length in front of people felt different. And I even started feeling like my voice was very deep, that it was coming across more masculine than I wanted. Even though I know rationally that the depth of your voice and masculinity are not intrinsically linked, but the awareness had attached itself to something that had previously just happened, like breathing, and now it required conscious management. And 3 of the examples I named, stretch marks, hip dips, your heartbeat, weren't problems until someone pointed them out. One of them, like my voice, it genuinely needed attention, because I would be in pain sometimes from having to talk in large groups of people or to talk at a louder volume if we were in a loud environment. And my voice was fatiguing a lot quicker and I would struggle the next day. But the awareness created a second insecurity that the original issue hadn't actually caused. And the thing is, you don't always know which kind of awareness you're getting until you're already inside it. And that's the cruel lottery of it. Awareness can free you or imprison you. And sometimes you can't tell which it's doing until it's done it. And there is a specific irony in all of this that I want to focus on. To even notice that you're becoming over-aware of something, you need to be self-aware. To catch the awareness paradox happening, you need the very thing that's causing it. You've got to be self-aware to be self-aware, which means there's no clean exit from outside the system. You're always working from inside it. And this is actually the inverse of what I talked about in episode 15 with semantic satiation. There, repetition dissolves meaning. The word becomes just noise after enough repetition. Here, attention creates meaning where there wasn't any. The body part becomes a source of anxiety after enough scrutiny. Same mechanism, completely opposite direction. And I want to say something explicitly here because this podcast has been an exercise in naming things. And some of what I've pointed out across this season might have introduced you to something you hadn't previously considered. If the pointing out, if the naming has been useful, I'm glad. And hopefully it's helped in some way. But if it's created a new preoccupation with something that wasn't previously a preoccupation, I want to say clearly that doesn't automatically mean it needs fixing. Sometimes awareness is useful. Sometimes it's just wait and you're allowed to set it down. And I do want to speak to you directly for a second before I continue. You might not have had a voice injury. You might not be a writer or have two cultures that make up who you are. You might not have things like stretch marks or hip dips as specific insecurities. But I'd honestly be surprised if there isn't something in your life that you became aware of and then couldn't stop being aware of. Whether that's a habit someone pointed out, a feature of yourself you'd never considered until someone had named it, a behaviour that used to feel automatic until the day you caught yourself doing it and couldn't unsee it. The specific thing is mine, but the mechanism is universal. And that's the awareness paradox. And once it's in your life, you'll start seeing it everywhere. The awareness paradox leads directly into what I'd call the perception paradox, which is the question underneath it. Other people can help us discover ourselves, but other people can also invent insecurities we never needed. Without feedback from the people around us, we might never improve. With too much of it, we might stop belonging to ourselves. We absorb their version of us until we can't easily locate our own. And I've talked about this across several episodes, specifically the absorbing and projecting thread from episodes 6 and 8. But I want to bring it in here as its own paradox because it's the specific version of the awareness problem that comes from other people rather than from our own observation. And one of the clearest examples I have is about posture. I didn't know my posture was a problem until it was pointed out. And then when I saw a picture of myself, that comment came echoing back and I thought, oh, right, that actually needs fixing. And luckily for me, in some ways, as I started focusing on it more, my shoulder injury started to make more sense, and I realised that these two were quite strongly linked. And things clicked into place. No pun intended. But the stretch marks didn't, and don't, need fixing. Nor do the hip dips. Those are things I was perfectly fine with until a particular corner of the internet decided they were things to be self-conscious about. And once I was aware of them, I couldn't just make myself unaware. So whose voice do you listen to? That's the question the perception paradox leaves you with. The feedback from outside can be the thing that finally shows you something true about yourself. It can also be the thing that installs an insecurity you'd have been better off without. And the tricky part is that from the inside, both of them feel like revelation. And this is where episode 15 comes back in. Context changes everything. Not just in how we communicate, but in how we receive. The same comment can be completely weightless to one person and genuinely destabilizing to another. Not because one person is weaker or more sensitive, but because of the context each person has attached to whatever is being said. When someone pointed out my posture, it mattered to me in a specific way because I already had context around it, which was the shoulder injury and years of sitting a certain way. Physical evidence that something just wasn't quite right. The comment had something to attach itself to. If someone had said the same thing to a person with no history of shoulder problems and no existing awareness of their posture, it might have just been a passing observation. Same words, but a completely different weight to them. And the hip dips example works the same way. The comment itself is neutral. It's just a description of a physical feature. But depending on the context you've absorbed, what beauty standards you grew up with, what media you consumed, what comments were made about your body before that one, the same observation can feel like a verdict or like nothing at all. When I was called weird as a kid, the context attached to that word was entirely negative. It meant you didn't fit. It meant you were being excluded. It was used as a weapon in a specific social environment where fitting in felt like survival. But weird on its own is just a descriptor. It means out of the ordinary, which could just as easily be intriguing. And the same shift has happened with nerdy, which I talked about in episode 15. 20 or 30 years ago, it was an insult. Whereas now, it's often a compliment. But the word itself hasn't changed, just the context around it has. And what that means is that the weight of a word isn't fixed in the word itself. It's fixed in you, in what you've already accumulated before that word arrives. Which means the perception paradox isn't really about other people at all. It's about the context you're carrying when their words reach you. And I think this is worth sitting with, regardless of whether you've ever been in therapy or done shadow work or read a self-help book in your life. Because the perception paradox doesn't require any of that. It just requires having people in your life. And everyone has people in their life. Someone has said something to you that lodged. Something that attached itself to see how you see yourself. And somewhere, you're still carrying it. Negative or positive. But the question this paradox asks is, was that person showing you something true, or were they introducing something into you that you'd have been better off without? And can you actually tell the difference? The next paradox is the control paradox, and this is the one I promised to come back to from episode 13. In episode 13, I talked about the tension in spirituality and manifestation between being told to be specific, to live in the end, to act with intention, and being told to release control, to trust the process, to not grip the how. Both messages exist in the same framework and they pull in opposite directions. And I said I'd give it proper space here. So here's the personal version first. My first fanfic, the first book in the duology I've mentioned across the season, went somewhere unexpected. For a long time, it was stuck on a certain number of reads. And then, after a particular chapter, it took off. Within about a year, it went from single-digit thousands to three-digit thousands of reads. And as I record this now, it's at over 231,000, which is just insane. It absolutely blows my mind. I can't even picture that many people in a room. But the thing that matters is that I wasn't trying, I was just writing. I wasn't monitoring its progress in a way that changed how I was working. I was just inside the world I'd built, enjoying it, and the readers came. Whereas when I wrote the second book, I knew what the first one had done, and I tried to recreate it. I was intentional about the things that had worked, tried to honour what I'd established. And I am proud of what I made. It's very intricately built, there's a lot of interwoven lore in it, and real structural work that was genuinely painful to figure out sometimes. But I was gripping so tightly to make it perform the way the first had that I forgot to just enjoy being in the world. And looking back now, I miss it. I miss being in that world the way I was during the first book. And I think if I'd held it just a little more loosely, I would have enjoyed writing it more. Not necessarily made it better, just enjoyed it more. And that's the control paradox in miniature. The thing worked when you weren't watching it. Then you started watching it, and the watching changed something. And I've mentioned this previously too, but Neville Goddard talks about living in the end. You write the outcome, inhabit the feeling, and act as if. The intention was the starting point. The releasing was the thing that made space for it to arrive. But if you're highly self-aware, genuinely releasing is almost impossible because you're monitoring. You're aware of your own grip. And the awareness of the grip can itself become a form of gripping. You try to release and then notice that you're trying to release, and the noticing is its own kind of holding on. The Yerkes-Dodson law, which I mentioned in episode 13 in a different context, applies here too. There's an optimal zone of engagement. Too little and nothing happens. Too much and performance degrades. The Goldilocks zone applies not just to effort and essays, but to self-awareness itself. Too little and you're just running on automatic. Too much and you're paralysed by your own observation. And the sweet spot sits in the middle. And the self-aware person's specific challenge is that they often know exactly where the sweet spot is and still can't quite find it, because the knowing is what pushes them past it. And you don't have to have written fan fiction or any kind of story for this one to resonate. Think about anything you've ever done that worked specifically because you weren't watching it too closely. That could be a conversation that flowed because you stopped trying to be interesting. A piece of work that came out well because you'd run out of time to overthink it. A relationship that moved forward because you'd given up trying to manage the outcome. The control paradox shows up everywhere. Wherever you've tried harder and gotten less, that's probably it. And wherever something arrived when you'd stopped watching the door, that's it too. And so, from the control paradox comes the choice paradox. Before you were aware of a pattern, it just happened. After you're aware of it, every instance becomes a decision. And that's actually where all of this began, in episode 2 with the white lies. Before I noticed the pattern, they just came out. After I noticed, every temptation to soften the truth became a conscious choice point. Do I do this? Do I not? Is this one of the ones that matters? The behaviour that used to be automatic became a moral question to answer in real time, multiple times a day. The same happens with posture, with eating habits, with how you speak to yourself, with exercise. Before awareness, these things just are. After awareness, they're choices. And choices are exhausting in a way that automaticity isn't. My skin picking habit is another version of this, and I talked about it, I think, in episode 7. I know why I do it. I know what triggers it. I know what the cycle looks like. Stress creates the urge creates the picking creates more stress, which creates more picking. I've named every part of that loop, and I still do it sometimes. Because knowing the loop doesn't automatically break the loop. And that's the gap. And this is the episode 3 thesis in its most difficult and specific form. No one is coming to do it for you. But the implication underneath that is even harder to sit with. Every moment is now a decision point that used to just be lived through. The cavalry isn't coming. You are the cavalry. And being the cavalry means being on duty constantly. That's liberation and burden at the same time. And nobody tells you in advance which it's going to feel like on any given day. And your version of this might look completely different. It might be the way you speak to yourself after a bad day, the automatic reach for your phone when you're burnt out, the way you eat when you're stressed, the pattern you fall into in conflict. Whatever the habit is, I think most people who've done any kind of self-reflection have experienced this specific frustration. You know what you're doing. You know why you're doing it. You know what the better choice would be. And sometimes you make it, and sometimes you don't. And the gap between the knowing and the doing doesn't close just because the knowing gets more detailed. And that's the choice paradox. And it's one of the most human things I can think of. Yet, the hindsight paradox is the most quietly frustrating of all of them. You can only know whether something was a mistake after you've already made it. And in reverse, you can only know if something was good after it's happened. Truly good for you, is what I mean. And self-awareness is supposed to help you make better decisions. And it does, over time, but it can't give you the information you need before you have the experience that produces it. You have to do the thing first. And then, only then, do you find out whether doing the thing was right. I've had projects that took significant time and energy and turned out not to go where I thought they would. Not failures exactly, just things that didn't become what I hoped, and I couldn't have known that they wouldn't become that until I was already deep inside them. And the self-aware part of me, looking back, can trace exactly where the pivot point was. Can see the moment things started going in a direction that wasn't going to work. And I can identify what I'd do differently now. But I couldn't see any of that in the moment because in the moment I didn't have the hindsight yet. The hindsight only exists because I did the thing. And doing the thing was the only way to get to the hindsight. Which means the mistake, if that's what it was also the education. And there was no way to get the education without paying the tuition. And this is actually what makes self-awareness specifically useful over time rather than immediately. The more experiences you accumulate, the more data you have to pattern match against, the more times you've done a version of a thing, the earlier you can recognize when the current version of the thing is going sideways. But you still have to do the versions. You can't shortcut the accumulation, unfortunately. And there's a specific cruelty in the hindsight that self-awareness brings. Because once you can see the pattern, you can also see all the previous times the pattern showed up and you didn't recognize it yet. You look back and think, oh, that was the same thing, wasn't it? That was another version of the same mistake. And the clarity that should feel like progress can sometimes feel more like an inventory of everything you didn't know in time. But the reframe that helps me is this. Every version of the thing that didn't work was also the thing that made the next version possible. The project that didn't go where I wanted gave me information I couldn't have gotten any other way. So essentially, the mistake was also the map. And you can't read the map until you've already made the journey. That's the hindsight paradox. And it's also, I think, one of the most specific reasons self-awareness compounds over time rather than delivering everything at once. But then we come to the mirror paradox, which is the most disorienting one. Self-awareness promises authenticity. It promises that if you look at yourself clearly enough, you'll find the real version of you underneath everything that's been layered on top. And that's true, to a point. But the more self-aware you become, the easier it is to perform authenticity rather than live in it. Because you can start watching yourself. Am I being authentic right now? Is this the real response or the managed one? Am I doing this because I want to or because I've convinced myself I want to? Am I analysing myself? And eventually you're watching yourself live instead of simply living. I talked about the panopticon in episode 11, the imaginary watcher you might have internalised. The mirror paradox is what happens when you've taken that all the way. There's no outside force anymore. You've internalised the whole system. You are both the observer and the observed permanently without being able to switch either off. And this creates a specific problem for confidence, which I talked all about in episode 12. Confidence, in its most functional form, comes from not thinking about yourself. It comes from being absorbed in the thing you're doing rather than monitoring how you're doing it. Athletes might call it flow. Writers might call it finding the rhythm. Psychologists call it automaticity. And self-awareness, by definition, interrupts that. The more you watch yourself, the less you can lose yourself in anything. So the goal of self-awareness is, paradoxically, to eventually not need it anymore, I think. To watch yourself long enough that the watching produces a person who no longer needs constant watching. To make the good choices so many times that they stop being choices and start being just who you are. To get to the other side of the mirror. This one might be the most familiar to anyone who's spent time on any kind of self-improvement journey. The moment you started paying attention to yourself, something shifted. Things that used to just happen become things you notice, and then the things you judge, and then things you try to manage. And at a certain point, you might wonder whether you were more relaxed before you started. Whether ignorance was, in some specific ways, actually bliss. I think the answer is yes, sometimes. And also, you can't go back. And also, that's okay. Because the goal was never to be someone who never notices. It was to be someone who notices and then eventually doesn't have to work so hard at it anymore. But it's the courage paradox. That's the one no one warns you about. Self-awareness is scary. Not in a vague, abstract way, in a very specific, practical way. Because the whole project of it is to look at yourself honestly. And sometimes what you find is something you don't like. And I've been there. I've sat with a realization about myself, about a habit, a reaction, a pattern of behaviour, and immediately felt the retrospective guilt of it. Running back through all the times I'd done that thing, said that thing, responded in that way, and thinking, oh, was that how it came across? Did I do that to someone? Is that something I've been carrying without realising the weight of it? That guilt is real. And it's one of the things nobody warns you about when they talk about the benefits of self-reflection. Because the benefit is clear enough. Know yourself, change yourself, grow. What's less discussed is the cost of knowing. The fact that some of what you find will make you feel bad. Not in a productive, motivating way, more of a sitting with the discomfort of something uncomfortable about yourself way. And that discomfort has to go somewhere. You have to do something with the information. And if you're new to this, if you've only just started looking, you might not know yet what to do with it. And sometimes the awareness is there before the acceptance is. You can know something about yourself, see it clearly, and still not be ready to consciously acknowledge it or take accountability for it. Because acknowledging it means admitting it. And admitting it means it becomes real in a way it wasn't before you said it out loud. Sometimes the unsaid thing feels more manageable than the said one. Keeping it just below the surface, half noticed, not quite named. I talked about the shadow in episode 8. The things we push down because they don't fit the version of ourselves we want to present. Part of why the shadow stays shadow is exactly this. It's not always that we don't know it's there. Sometimes we know it's there and we're not ready to look at it directly. Because looking at it directly means having to decide what to do with it. And then there's the version of this that involves other people. Admitting something uncomfortable about yourself to someone else is its own specific kind of terrifying. What if they agree? That's the one that gets me. If I say something unflattering about myself and the person I'm saying it to just quietly nods, that confirmation can feel worse than the original realization. And if they disagree, but you don't believe them, then you either have to convince them or drop it. And either option is exposing in a different way. And this connects directly back to episode 11. Fear was always the point. The anticipatory dread profile, the fear that builds before anything has even happened, shows up here too. The fear of what you might find if you look. The fear of what it means about you if you find it. The fear of what you do with it once you found it. And the fear of saying it out loud to anyone at all. But here's what I've come to understand about that fear. It's not a sign that you're a bad person. It's a sign that you're a person who cares about being good. And I think that, to an extent, people who genuinely don't care don't feel guilty about their habits and patterns. The guilt is evidence of the standard, and the courage to look anyway, to give a name to the thing, even though naming it makes it real, to take accountability even when accountability is uncomfortable, that courage is the whole point of this season. It's also, I think, one of the most specific ways self-awareness is worth it. Not because looking at the uncomfortable thing feels good, but because not looking at it costs more in the long run. The things you don't look at don't stay still. They compound. They show up in your behaviour, in your relationships, in the patterns you keep repeating without understanding why. Looking at them is hard, but it's less hard than the alternative. And courage isn't the absence of discomfort. It's deciding the discomfort is worth it. And I said that in episode 12, and I'll say it again properly in the finale, but it belongs here as well, because this is where it's more tested. Not in the big, visible moments, but in the quiet, private moment of deciding to look at the thing you'd rather not look at, and then deciding to do something about it. And the final paradox is the scaffolding paradox, and it's the most present tense for me right now. At the start of June, I joined a 6-month fitness coaching program. And I've talked about my relationship with exercise across the season, the all in and bail pattern, the shift from exercising for external reasons to exercising because it genuinely helps me, and the consistency I've built over the last couple of years. But I hit a plateau. I stopped pushing myself, and I was allowing excuses in order to avoid discomfort. But I recognised the pattern, I gave it a name, and I decided to do something about it. So I chose 6 months. And 2 months in, my brain keeps defaulting to a very specific thought. It's only for 6 months. After December, I can go back to eating how I used to, and I can be less strict, and I won't have to think about it this much. And every time that thought pops up, I catch it. And I have to remind myself, no, that's not what this is. This isn't a temporary correction. This is a lifestyle shift. And the program is the scaffolding. The goal isn't to get through 6 months. It's to become the kind of person who makes these choices without needing the scaffolding anymore. Because scaffolding isn't the building. It's what you put up while you're building the building. And at some point, if you've done the work, you take it down, and what's left is something that stands on its own. Think about brushing your teeth. For most of us, we probably don't wake up every morning and debate whether it's worth it. You just do it. Not because it's exciting, but because it's become part of who you are and how you function. Healthy eating, movement, posture, strength, for me, they're all aiming in the same direction. Not constant vigilance, but embedded habits that run in the background without requiring a daily decision. So the scaffolding comes down and the building stays. And this is where the knowing-doing gap I talked about in episode 13 comes back in its most specific form. In that episode, I said knowing and doing are two completely different things. You can know the essay trick, you can know the Goldilocks zone, you can know that gripping the outcome makes things worse, and still grip. The scaffolding paradox is that version of the knowing-doing gap applied to habits. I know the 6 months thought is wrong. I know what it's doing. I can explain exactly why it's unhelpful. And then sometimes I have it again anyway, because catching a thought doesn't stop it. You still have to choose differently every single time until the choice becomes the default. Until the scaffolding becomes unnecessary because the building can hold itself up. And the gap between catching it and changing it is where most of the actual work happens. It's unglamorous, it's repetitive, it's much less interesting than the initial moment of insight. But it's the territory. Whatever your version of the 6 months thought is, you might know it when I name it. It's the thing your brain keeps offering you as an exit. Something along the lines of, I'll start properly on Monday. Or once this busy period is over. Or I'll do it when things settle down. Self-awareness doesn't stop that thought from arriving, but it does mean you can catch it. And catching it, even when you don't immediately change the behaviour, is still the work. It's still progress. Just slower and less satisfying than the breakthrough moments suggest. And this is where episode 12 comes back in. Confidence is just a performance. Not in a cynical way, but in a more genuinely useful way. Because sometimes the only way to get to the other side of a habit, a fear, a pattern, is to perform the version of yourself that's already there before you fully feel it. For me, after years of telling small white lies, choosing honesty felt uncomfortable in a way that the lying never had. The lying had become automatic, and the honesty required effort. I had to perform the honest version of myself consciously, repeatedly, until it stopped feeling like a performance and started feeling like just who I was. And I talked about this in episode 2, and choosing raw honesty. It took courage every single time. Not just once, every single time. And this podcast is another version of it. I have never done anything like this before. Sure, things like school plays when I was growing up, yes. A promotional video for my university, yes. And I talked about that in an earlier episode, but sitting here, episode after episode, laying out my theories and my personal stories and the things I've never really said out loud before, that's different. I didn't know how to do this. I still don't fully. What I did was start. I performed the version of myself that was capable of doing it before I was sure I actually was. And somewhere across 17 episodes, the performance has started to become the thing itself. I think that the phrase, fake it till you make it, does get a bad reputation because it sounds like dishonesty. But what it actually describes is something much more precise. I think it's the willingness to act as if the change has already happened before your nervous system has caught up with the decision. To pretend not to be embarrassed until eventually you aren't. To perform the confidence until the performance becomes the reality. To allow yourself to be misunderstood in the short term so that you can start to accept yourself in the long term. And now that I say it out loud, there's a paradox in that too. You have to perform authenticity in order to reach it. You have to fake the thing in order to make it real. You have to be misunderstood by others in order to understand yourself. And the thing is, there's a paradox in everything I've talked about this season. The white lies were told in service of honesty. The self-censorship requires you to know what to censor before you can censor it, which means the very act of managing what you reveal demands a level of self-knowledge you might not have had yet. Trying harder doesn't always work, so you have to release control in order to have it. And yet you can't be so detached that nothing changes. The shadow was just the parts of yourself that hadn't found a safe place to exist yet. The bid for connection in episode 16 required letting yourself be misunderstood first. The confidence was always a performance before it became real. So every single episode, a paradox underneath it. And maybe that's the most honest thing I can say about self-awareness. It isn't a straight line. It isn't a clean process with a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's recursive and contradictory and sometimes exhausting, and occasionally, just occasionally, it produces a moment of clarity so precise that it makes all of it worth it. Self-awareness is a paradox in itself. And that's exactly what episode 18 is about. But here's what connects all of these paradoxes. Self-awareness starts as a tool you use. The paradox is that at a certain point, the tool starts using you. The awareness you sought creates problems you didn't have before. The release you're trying to practice becomes a form of gripping. The choices you now make consciously are exhausting in a way that automatic behaviour never was. The authenticity you're working toward can tip into the performance of authenticity. The courage required to look at the uncomfortable thing is genuinely frightening. The hindsight that should feel like progress can feel like an inventory of everything you didn't know in time. And the habits you're building require such sustained attention that the attention itself can become the obstacle. And none of this means self-awareness isn't worth it. Episode 18 is going to answer that question properly, but it does mean that self-awareness isn't a solution. It's a process. And the process has specific costs, specific ironies, specific ways of turning against itself that nobody tends to name in advance. I think the purpose of self-awareness isn't to spend the rest of your life watching yourself. I think it's to watch yourself long enough that the person you're trying to become eventually becomes the person you are. Self-awareness is the bridge, not the destination. And once you've crossed it, the goal isn't to stand in the middle admiring the engineering, it's to keep walking. And that's where episode 18 picks up. Everything I've said across this season, every episode, every thread, every paradox, whether it was worth it. I think you already know what I'm going to say, but I want to talk about it properly. So this episode, Uncomfortably Honest, is this. There have been moments in making this podcast where I've caught myself analysing the experience of making it while I was in the middle of making it. I was noticing my own noticing, watching myself be vulnerable. And in those moments, the thing that should have been natural became performed, at least for a second, before I could get back to it. And that's the mirror paradox in real time. The watching itself. And I'm aware right now that naming it, pointing it out, might make it happen again. That's just where we are at episode 17. That's the whole thing. Here's what I want to leave you with. Is there something you've become aware of that you sometimes wish you could unknow? And what would it take to get to the other side of it, where the awareness has done its work and you can just live again? If you've been with me all season, the last episode, episode 18, is next. And it's the one that answers the question the first episode asked. Don't forget to follow or subscribe to make sure you catch future episodes. It really means a lot. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you in the next one. Bye!